thanks so much for being here, Naomi. It's great to see you again. Naomi was here for our 100th anniversary celebration, and that was a great fun event too. Tell us how you got interested in this global climate change movement after the shock doctrine.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and wonderful to see the whole progressive gang together. So my last book, The Shock Doctrine, really ends with climate change. And in a way, it also begins because Hurricane Katrina bookmarks that book. It's the opening and the closing. And that, for those of you who read The Shock Doctrine, it's about what I call disaster capitalism and the use of different kinds of shocks to push through a very radical right-wing agenda of privatization and deregulation and attacks on the public sphere. And Hurricane Katrina is kind of a textbook case of that. When I started The Shock Doctrine, it was, I think as you know, it was going to just be a book about Iraq. And then I started to see how this tactic was being used in the wake of all kinds of different shocks, not just wars, but economic crises, and indeed how it has been used for a very long time in the wake of economic crises. But then I started to notice how it was happening in the aftermath of natural disasters, some of them linked to climate change. So I end The Shock Doctrine with this, quite frightening vision of climate apartheid, right? Where if you have wealth and means, then you can survive this shock-ridden future through an increasingly privatized response to disaster, which is what we saw during Hurricane Katrina. But if you depend on the state, then you're literally abandoned, and that was the horror of that catastrophe, was that collision between heavy weather and weak and neglected public infrastructure and governance, right? Where those levees that had been neglected collapsed, and then it seemed like FEMA couldn't find New Orleans, right, for 5 days. So this book is in many ways a sequel, right? It is, and it's a response to a lot of what I heard when touring with The Shock Doctrine, which is how can we guard against this tactic, but also is there a progressive version of this? Is there a progressive way to respond to crisis that isn't opportunistic, but actually gets at the root causes of why these disasters are coming so fast and furious? And of course, there is a progressive tradition of responding to crisis with deep social change for the better. So I started to see how climate change could be the catalyst, could be just such a catalyst. And this was first explained to me in an interview I did with a Bolivian trade official named Angelica Navarro, who I quote at the beginning of the book, who describes how climate change can be a catalyst for what she called a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. And once I sort of wrapped my head around that, about how the climate crisis forces us to confront inequality between our nations and within our nations, I could see a path forward that was a way to deal with our economic crisis of inequality and the climate crisis at the same time.
So how do we get after that deep social change you're talking about?
Well, I think the first step is just naming the fact that we cannot deal with this crisis without a profound shift in ideological direction in the values that govern our society. And so a fair amount of the book is diagnosing why we have failed. I mean, and that we have failed is pretty much an uncontroversial position. Emissions are up 61% since we started trying to solve this crisis, right? So what we've been doing hasn't been working. And the environmental movement, it occupies a funny place on the left. It isn't, there are parts of it that are genuinely progressive and genuinely left, but it also has deep roots in a much more conservative tradition that is really about, elites conserving bits of wilderness for their, hunting and hiking enjoyment. And I think because of that conservative side of the movement, there has been a kind of allergy to what is seen as politicizing the issue, right? So the discourse is very much like, this is beyond left and right, it's right and wrong, this affects everybody equally, so it's really erased a lot of the genuine inequalities and interests at the heart of this issue. And failed to make some really obvious points, like the ones I'm making in my book, which is this is the essence of a collective crisis. We cannot respond to a crisis of this scale and nature without basically breaking every rule in the free market playbook. We need to regulate corporations, we need to tax the polluters, we need international law. We need all these things we've been told we can't have. We need to intervene in the market. We need to subsidize what we want. We need to punish what we don't want. And this hit us at precisely the moment when all of these ideas were falling so radically out of fashion. So we moved very far in one ideological direction, and it's pretty much tied our hands. Also in some very concrete ways. Like if you think about the waves of privatization that happened during the 1990s, key years in the climate debate, our governments were systematically selling off many of the key sectors that are most critical for responding, whether it's railways or transit systems, energy grids. It would be really useful if we hadn't sold those off. And indeed, what I show in the book is that as people start to take climate change seriously, as they are, for instance, in Germany, where you have this very dramatic energy transition going on, they are having to confront the logic of privatization, and there has been a wave of what's called remunicipalization, where hundreds of cities and towns have voted to take back their energy grids and transition to renewable energy. I also show how free trade deals are very actively standing in the way of what we need to do, and governments that introduce good green policies, like where I live in Ontario, we had a good green energy plan that had ambitious emission reduction targets, but also a really great job creation component that required that that anybody who wanted to take advantage of our feed-in tariff program needed to produce a certain percentage of their solar panels and wind turbines locally in Ontario. It created 31,000 jobs, and it was successfully challenged at the World Trade Organization as an unfair sort of protectionist policy.
Here in the United States, things seem a little harder to get to work in favor of the environment, in favor of people. I mean, you still have market fundamentalism, as you call it, ruling the waves here. What do we need to do here?
Well, you need a massive ideological shift, and this idea of trying to avoid it is exactly the wrong approach. The urgency of the climate change should bring an existential imperative to doing what we already know we need to do, which is radically shift the pole in the other direction, to the left. And I think climate can be a real coalition builder between different sectors. We've become so siloed, and we've lost in too many parts of the country, less so here, but the tradition of social movements, of broad-based social movements that come together in common cause. And so, we know that there's a democratic crisis in this country that has to do with people not being represented, not often being allowed to vote, and also the tremendous power of corporate money over politics. And this stands in the way of pretty much anything progressive that people might want to do. It certainly stands in the way of climate action because we're up against the richest sector in the world with the deepest pockets, and they don't just have money to burn; they have money to bribe, and they do it.
Right, and they're going to extract every drop of fossil fuel until the earth burns up if we don't stop.
Well, I mean, this is what's been what has really kicked off the fossil fuel divestment movement, which is, I think, a real sign of hope. The fact that we see divestment movements on hundreds of university campuses, within faith organization, trade unions, pension funds, city councils. This was catalyzed by this quite explosive research out of the UK, the Carbon Tracker research, that calculated how much fossil fuel companies have in their proven reserves, and compared that to how much scientists tell us how much carbon we can burn and still stay below the agreed upon temperature target of 2 degrees Celsius. and found that they already have 5 times more carbon in their proven reserves already counted towards their bottom line than our atmosphere can absorb. So their business model is at war with life on Earth, and that that has been. I think that what's happening with divestment is pretty critical, not just because people are moving their money and the potential to reinvest that money in the economy that we need as we wait for governments to act, but also because those profits are being delegitimized in the public debate. Anytime anyone makes that argument, these are morally illegitimate profits. Therefore, we want this public interest institution to separate itself. That brings us one step closer to a polluter pays framework, because if those profits are morally too illegitimate for Harvard to profit from, then the public also has a right to those profits to pay for the costs of this transition, on the same model as the tobacco companies eventually became, so delegitimized that through a combination of public policy and court rulings, we were able to harness a good deal of those profits to pay for public health campaigns to convince people to quit smoking, and public health costs related to smoking as well. I mean, that's the kind of model on a larger scale we need to help pay the bills for the climate crisis that are already locked in, and also to transition us away from fossil fuels.
Are there other signs of hope beyond the divestment movement that you can point to?
Yeah, I mean, I was tremendously heartened by the People's Climate March in New York City.
What was that like? I wasn't there.
It was an amazing day, and it was a day that that was the result of a huge amount of hard work for months leading up to it. But even so, talking to some of the key organizers, everyone was surprised by just how big it was. It was beyond the sort of wildest hopes and expectations to have 400,000 people in the streets. But the thing to me that was most exciting beyond the numbers was the diversity of the march, because I've been to a lot of climate demonstrations that are just a sea of white, and sort of a march of the NGOs, and that didn't have any kind of grassroots urgency. And I think what's really shifted, and this is what I sort of chronicle in the final section of the book about Blockadia, is that there is a new climate movement, and it is the flip side of the fossil fuel boom that we have been living through, the extreme energy boom represented by tar sands and all the pipelines associated, the coal export terminals that are being proposed up and down the Pacific Northwest, the oil by rail from fracked oil from the back end, and of course fracking. So because we've been in the midst of this fossil fuel frenzy, it has set off its own opposition. In a way, I used to say about the WTO protests that we should thank the WTO because they built our coalitions for us. There is a way in which the fossil fuel companies have inadvertently built our movement for us in these past few years, but with their sheer ambition, with their sheer chutzpah, of going into so many communities simultaneously. And hey, we found each other. I mean, in part thanks to social media. And what was beautiful about the march was, a lot of this is these are virtual connections. But for a day, those virtual connections became physical as people came together, and all of these parts of Blockadia marched in the streets. And the other thing that really gave me hope was seeing communities, frontline communities that are downstream from extractive projects, dealing with cancer clusters, high asthma rates, really marching for their lives, but also marching for the hope of a more economically just future. I mean, trade unions were out in huge numbers, and marching for climate jobs, marching for the kind of infrastructure and social service investments that will get us out of this crisis. And this to me is really key, because at the heart of our climate failure has been this an urgency gap between the two sides in this debate, where you had the fossil fuel companies, the big agribusiness companies, who understand that they have a huge amount to lose should we start taking climate change seriously. And they fight really hard, and they fight really dirty. And on the other side, you have some great climate activists, but you also have a lot of kind of liberals who sort of care about climate change on a good day, right? But if anything else comes up, like it goes to the bottom of the list, and that's why climate justice, isn't a climate justice response, which says we need to put the frontline communities first in line to benefit from this transition. We need responses that close the inequality gap, that bring resources to the people who need it most. Not just because it's morally right, but also because it's the only way we'll win. Because the only way you can win a battle against forces that have as much to lose as the fossil fuel companies and their allies is by building a movement made up of a lot of people with a great deal to gain. And that's what climate's never really had in its sort of kind of big green manifestation, right? It's been this abstracted issue that you care about because it's the right thing to do. And that's been because the justice side has been neglected.
You are reminding me of a passage, and this changes everything, that it's just not enough to meditate and go to farmer's market and not drive, or in my case, drive a Prius. You've got to do more than that. What is the more than that you want us all to do?
Well, I think the more than that is joining a movement, right? And fighting for the regulatory changes that we need. And so, we always have to remember that we are organizing in the rubble of this successful ideological onslaught. And part of the success of that onslaught has been the recasting of us purely as consumers. And it has been so successful that often, the first question I get in a Q&A is, what's the one thing I can do? Like what is the one consumer change I can make? Because we've been trained so much to see ourselves as consumers. So, farmers markets matter, and it's better to bike, than drive, and it's better to drive a Prius than an SUV, and all of that, right? But we just can't mistake that for, political activism. That's not the same thing. One thing I would just add is that, things like farmers markets and sharing banks and, other things that we do at a community level, they do matter in the sense that they show what's possible, and they show that this isn't punishment. In fact, it improves our quality of life, but also because it strengthens community. And that's a climate response in the sense that we've already locked in some pretty heavy weather. And one of the most important things we need to do to prepare for that weather is not just build stronger seawalls, but build stronger communities where people know each other and look after each other during crises. So I don't want to, I don't mean to belittle all of that, but we also have to do that political organizing.
Well, Naomi Klein, thanks so much for having this little chat with us here, and This Changes Everything, a really crucial book I highly recommend. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you.